everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming to the conference or inquiry celebrating reason. My name is Shauna Watson and I'm Vice President of CFI Canada. For our next talk, we're going to be having Sean Manning, who's going to explain how ancient astronauts built the science fiction of Egypt. Dr. Manning is an ancient historian, Assyriologist, and philologist. He grew up on the west coast of Canada, studied in Calgary, and lived from 2013 to 2020 in Innsbruck, Austria. He's published one book and about 25 articles for both scholarly and popular audiences. I'm going to massacre this, but I'm going to give it a try, including Armed Force in the Teispid-Achaemenid Empire. Now go ahead, Sean.
Thanks everybody for coming. When I don't have anything as serious to talk about as the murder of atheists in Bangladesh or as pure fun as Mike Wong's talk this morning. But I do have something that connects popular culture, critical thinking, and cosmic horror that sort of speaks to CFI's many interests. And that's some changes in science fiction over the past few decades. Because today, if you turn on the TV or Netflix, there is plenty of ancient Egyptian science fiction. And I'm just going to bring up the slides now. Okay. There we are, got my main slide. Because every talk needs sucralose. So, I mean, today, if you turn on TV or Netflix, there's lots of science fiction with ancient Egyptian themes. The series Stargate SG-1 on TV and film, the film The Fifth Element from, I think, 1994. And even the science fiction war game Warhammer 40,000 has the Necrons. They're these kind of ancient Egyptian-themed robots who are buried under the earth and can be woken up and invade the planets with their floating pyramids and their mummy robots and their bad news. So, in popular culture today, ancient Egyptian and science fiction go together. But if we look back to the period that what we now know as science fiction was taking shape, the short stories of between, say, the 1930s and 1970s, we find something quite different. Ancient Egypt is popular, but not in science fiction. And looking how this theme became common can tell us some things about how ideas move between different areas of culture and about how ideas from one not very prestigious area of culture become mainstream. Now, what is science fiction is a question that can start 1,000 flame wars. But for me, it's the kind of thing that was written by a list of authors in the mid-20th century, mostly in short story form, mostly in the United States, or at least publishing in the United States. People like Lyons Sprague de Camp or H.B. and Piper. And so a philosopher would say I'm using an ostensive definition. I'm not creating some kind of abstract philosophical definition of science fiction that can clearly define what is science fiction, what is fantasy, what is space opera. I'm just saying things like these people wrote. And 1930, if you think about it, many people would point as a starting point to 1939 when Robert A. Heinlein published his first short story with John W.I. Campbell Jr. And certainly around the late 30s, things that we would call science fiction are becoming easy to identify. And for an endpoint is much harder to justify, but I think you could say that by the 1970s, science fiction was a well-recognized thing, and a lot of the things that science fiction fans and writers in the 1930s and 1940s had hoped hadn't turned out the way they'd expected. There was a space program, but space turned out different than they thought it was going to be. There's no canals on Mars, there's no jungles on Venus, and getting around in space is a lot more dangerous and expensive than some people had hoped. So between the late 30s and the early 70s, I think you can talk of kind of a time when this kind of science fiction is taking shape. One thing that most of these writers had in common is that they wrote rational fiction. And rational fiction to me is stories where things happen because there's initial premise. It may be quite fantastical, but there's initial premise, and then we extrapolate the conclusions of that premise. So you might postulate, what if a mermaid came to Long Island and competed in a woman's swimming race? If it's a rational story, logically from it, what would be the implications of a mermaid competing in a swimming race? In a dramatic story, on the other hand, things happen because they're cool, or they make more excitement or more interpersonal conflict. So in a Star Wars film, for example, it has a lot of science fictional tropes. It has spaceships, it has ray guns, but nothing in a Star Wars film happens because it's the logical conclusion of some kind of premise. If a Jedi can do something in one film, there's no guarantee they can do the same thing in the next film, and there certainly isn't an attempt to explore the implications for galactic society of Jedi being able to do this or that. So I think thinking about this rational style of storytelling can maybe be more helpful than thinking about these tropes like spaceships. Now, if you look at this list of authors, I see quite a few who had intense interest in the ancient world. Fred Paul, for example, wrote the Encyclopedia Britannica entry for the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Paul Anderson created the whole Time Patrol series so he could tell stories set in the ancient world. Star Trek is full of Greek, Roman, and biblical themes, from the god Apollo in the original series, the Genesis, Mirror Universe, Federation in the new Star Trek Discovery. And, of course, several of these authors even wrote fiction set in ancient Egypt. Harry Turtledove, for example, wrote a whole Ancient of Byzantium alternate history series set in an alternate Byzantine Empire. And in these stories, there's one set in ancient Egypt. Or L. Sprague de Camp set 3 of his historical novels in Achaemenid or Ptolemaic Egypt. The Dragon of the Ishtar Gate, the Bronze God of Rhodes, and the Golden Wind. And of course, and yet, when these authors got out their typewriters to write science fiction, they lost interest in Egypt. It's actually easier to talk about a classic science fiction story with a Hittite theme than an ancient Egyptian theme. H.B. Piper's short story Omnilingual is famous because it's about historical linguists and archaeology on Mars. But it's also the story where one of the main characters is a Hittite archaeologist. He's the good foil for the heroine Martha Dane, as opposed to the sinister Tony Latimer, who just wants to get rich and famous from archaeology. Now, Tarhuna, the only Hittite god with a Twitter account, would probably be pleased by this representation in science fiction. But you have to admit that in general, ancient Egypt is more prominent in popular culture than the Hittites are. Ancient Egypt is cool. The Hittites are cool too, but you tend to see more ancient Egyptians in popular culture. And so, if the ancient world was predominant in science fiction, but ancient Egypt was not, why might that be? I don't think it's because tropes about ancient Egypt are particularly non-science fictional. Deep time, immortality, and life extension, strange creatures, monarchies, ruins with inscriptions and reliefs. These are all themes that science fiction authors love to explore, and they're themes that you can explore through ancient Egypt. And so before we look at how ancient Egypt became a popular theme in science fiction, we should look at why it was once unpopular. During the 1920s and 1930s, many of today's genres were taking shape. Agatha Christie was starting her career writing mysteries. Moulton Marston was creating Wonder Woman. But the boundaries between these different kinds of fantastic fiction weren't so well defined. Ancient Egypt was a fairly popular film in British and American fiction in the 1920s and 1930s. Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age, for example, has Stygia, a sinister Egypt with sorcerer kings and pyramids full of vampires. H.P. Lovecraft wrote Under the Pyramids as a ghostwriting project for Harry Houdini, who some of the skeptics here will know a lot about. In that story, Harry Houdini goes into the tunnels under the Great Sphinx and he encounters horrible things. So, of course, the first well-known version of the film, The Mummy, also came out in 1932, the Universal Pictures one. And then just think about the problem of classifying a story like Red Nails from 1936, if you can tear your eyes away from the lurid Margaret Brundage cover painting. Red Nails was the last published Conan story by Robert E. Howard. And it has a resurrected carnivorous stegosaurus, kinky Aztecs in the city lit by eerie radiation, mesmerism, and a magic laser wand. So is it fantasy or is it science fiction? There's plenty of science fiction stories about resurrecting dinosaurs from fossils. There's nothing about that trope, which has to be fantasy, but most people would say, on the whole, this is a fantasy story. And the title, the cover just said Weird Tales. So in the 1930s, these boundaries between science fiction, fantasy, and horror were not so well defined as they became later. Science fiction communities value knowledge of the genre's history and engagement with earlier stories. If you want to make a name for yourself as a science fiction author, the best thing to do is to write some story that engages with a famous earlier story or a famous earlier theme, but does something interesting and new. And to do this, you have to choose which history to acknowledge. It's just not possible to remember every story and every novel and every film that's ever come out. And a lot of those aren't going to help how you want to define science fiction. So Alec Neville Ali, for example, recently made a case that L. Ron Hubbard was one of the most successful science fiction authors in the 1940s. He got somewhat erased from history because he went on to found Dianetics and the Church of Scientology. And because of their activities, pretty soon nobody in the science fiction community wanted to have anything to do with him or them. And of course, John W.I. Campbell Jr. is more complicated because he's always had people who complained about he's always had detractors as well as boosters. But as he descended into evangelical racist crankery, speaking up for Dianetics and reactionist drives and racial segregation in schools, a lot of people in the science fiction community lost interest in him and his work. So he was very prominent in the 1940s, wasn't being remembered so much a few decades later. Now, science fiction writers and fans are a quarrelsome bunch, if you know them. And after the Second World War, there started to be some tensions in this weird mix of people who've been brought together. One side of this split was about the scientific worldview. One group of writers doubled down on secular materialism. L. Sprague de Camp wrote books skewering lost continent myths and creationism, and he joined CISCOP, the committee for the center, which eventually became the Center for Scientific Inquiry and a mainstay of the skeptical movement. CISCOP was interested in criticizing ideas like UFO. Isaac Asimov also had a period in the 1950s and 1960s when most of his writing was popular nonfiction. And when he did write science fiction, it was often didactic, things like the Lucky Star stories to teach astronomy to children. But this wasn't the only faction. There were other writers like Philip K. Dick or Robert A. Heinlein who embraced the more mystical worldview. Of course, L. Ron Hubbard turns in that direction as well, turning his pseudoscience of Dianetics into the Church of Scientology, and he ends up living on a yacht in international waters served by a bevy of pretty young things. And the mystics, interestingly, were often more interested in writing science fiction specifically than the materialists were. So when some people tell the story of Robert A. Heinlein, they tell the story about the time he needed to calculate a voyage to the moon in 1948 for the novel Rocket Ship Galileo. And he bought a big roll of butcher paper and he rolled it on his kitchen floor. And he and his wife, Virginia, sat down, and on opposite sides of that paper, they did the calculations by hand. And then when they'd done all the calculus for their mission to the moon, they switched sides of the paper and they each checked each other's work. And that way, Robert A. and Virginia Heinlein made sure that they were going to send their characters to the moon at the right speed for the rocket they'd imagined. So some people liked that story. And they don't often talk about his early odd stories about Mount Shasta and the hidden powers in the human mind, or the later stories in the world as myth cycle. These are both parts of Robert A. Heinlein's work throughout his career, but they appeal to different audiences. Now, there were some writers in between, like Larry Nevin. Nevin loved stories about micro black holes or massive artifacts, but he also liked to tell stories about psychic powers, or the idea that dolphins were intelligent in the same way and to the same extent that humans were. And so he didn't see a contradiction between carefully researching the astronomy for a story and writing a story about a detective with an invisible arm of psychic force. For him, that was all science fiction. In 1950, the cool new science fiction magazine was Horace Gold's Galaxy. And in the first issue of that, he put a famous advertisement declaring what his magazine was going to have in it. And this advertisement defined what he wanted to see as not like another kind of science fiction, not as the kind of story that's basically a Western or a sailing ship story rewritten with science fiction words instead of Old West words or Age of Sail words. And in the 1950s, 1960s, this kind of science fiction was quite popular with the kind of authors I'm talking about. Things like the travel and role-playing game setting, Paul Anderson's work, and H. Beam Piper's science fiction are good examples of the kind of thing that was popular in this circle in the 50s and 60s. P. Schuler Miller coined the term hard science fiction in 1957. And it's an interesting term because, on one hand, hard science fiction is all about physics, chemistry, astronomy, engineering. But on the other hand, it often has fantastical things like faster time travel, things that aren't really scientifically plausible in the physics and chemistry and astronomy that we know today. So somehow, plausibility, but about what kind of tropes you want to use. And in the world from 1950 onwards, in the science fiction community, there was pressure to remove some of the themes of early science fiction, and focus on others, which seemed more serious or more scientifical. And we've seen that many influential science fiction writers were keenly interested in ancient Greece and Rome. Isaac Asimov wrote his foundation stories after reading Edward Gibbon. Frederick Paul, Paul Anderson, David Drake, Jerry Pournelle, they were all quite interested in Greece and Rome, but not so much in Egypt. And these tend to side with the scientists over the mystics, on the whole. So I wonder if there's the pull of a founder effect of some of these influential writers encouraging other people to write about Greeks or Romans, but not Egyptians. And the push of a feeling that some of the weird themes associated with Egypt in pulp fiction and early science fiction weren't proper science fiction, or weren't the kind of science fiction that many people from 1950 onwards want to see. Because if you were a fiction writer and you wanted to write about the ancient world, you could use these Greek or Roman themes just fine. And if you wanted to write about ancient Egypt, you could write historical novels or romances or mysteries or fantasy stories. You didn't have to call it science fiction. So even though ancient Egypt makes for great stories, there wasn't any compelling need to use that for science fiction. And I'd say certainly ancient Egypt was more popular in American popular culture in the mid-20th century than it was in science fiction. in 1968, Eric von Daniken published Chariots of the Gods. And in this, he popularized the idea that aliens had landed on the Earth in the distant past and either built or inspired the building of various monuments and anomalous artifacts. And Fun-rooting historians and archaeologists pointed out that the evidence for most of his ideas was not very good. And different kinds of fun-rooters pointed out that the idea that some people, Europeans, can invent things, but other people in other parts of the world can only steal them or copy them, is deeply ethnocentric and racist. So it was an old European colonialist trope that anybody outside of Europe had to be copying things from Europe. They couldn't invent it themselves. Though von Daniken didn't feel the need to explain Greeks or Romans doing cool things, but when the Egyptians or Incas or Maya did that, he wanted to bring in aliens to explain it. But regardless of these problems, his derivative ethnocentric nonsense became a global sensation, while other people's was mostly forgotten. And I'm not sure of the reception of these ideas in science fiction communities, because as I said, I wasn't around back then. But I can say that TV and film communities loved his ideas. Now, it's important here, I'm not saying that TV and film communities are more credulous of his ideas than science fiction fans. Science fiction always engaged with weird ideas in a credulous way, as well as a ironic way and a critical way. But I think TV and film communities thought these ideas made for great stories, and that it wasn't necessarily the case in print science fiction, at least not in the early days. You can flip slides. Let's see if you can bring a slide forward. There we are. Okay, Doctor Who. So, for example, already in 1975, there was a Doctor Who miniseries in the UK, where archaeologists are digging in Egypt, and they cover an alien who turns out to be the Egyptian god Set. And Set, the alien, has some nasty plans, but luckily Doctor Who and his latest companion are there to stop them. Von Daniken also inspired this TV documentary, In Search of Ancient Astronauts, which became a whole TV series and the model for today's American paranormal television. If you flip on the TV in the United States, you'll see the History Channel and people like that putting on all kinds of these paranormal shows with speculations. And interestingly, Rod Sterling and Alan Landsberg, who directed the TV series In Search of Ancient Astronauts, had previously worked on the science fiction TV show Twilight Zone. And von Daniken, like I said, also inspired things like this Doctor Who series. We actually had, but it wasn't just, it was even more important things than that. If we move the slides forward. Okay, there we go, George Lucas. So we have what says it's a transcript of a conference between George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Larry Kasdan planning a film that became Raiders of the Lost Ark. And if you read this transcript, and I understand that it's never been officially confirmed by George Lucas, but it's supposed to be a transcript of audio tapes they made while they were sitting around the table brainstorming. George Lucas keeps on citing Eric von Daniken's book as a model they should use when they're putting this film together. So the evil archaeologist could be like an Eric von Daniken character working for the Nazis. And if the Ark was some kind of super high-powered radio, that could be like something from Eric von Daniken's Flying Saucers. And if there's something to do with the book of Leviticus, then they should look up Eric von Daniken's first book, Chariot of the Gods, for what he says about the Ark, and use this in their film. So the beautiful thing here was that in these TV and film communities, it didn't matter what some kind of science fiction fans and science fiction editors thought was good and bad science fiction, what was cool and what was a little bit déclassé. All that mattered was that these people thought that it was cool. And because the boundaries between science fiction and fantasy and horror are always so arbitrary and fuzzy, once there's one community that thought ancient astronauts or ancient Egypt and ancient aliens was a cool thing to bring together, then it could just explode in popularity. And it probably also helped that, for the most part, science fiction TV and film was not seen as a particularly serious kind of thing. It was seen as something kind of childish, where you could play with things because they were fun, and not do things that you want to be really respectable. So, if you wanted to pull up some things from the pulps that you thought were cool that didn't seem very fashionable, this was a good place to put them. And TV and film can reach mass audiences which books and short stories can't reach. That's just the nature of the medium. And the audiences that watch these films and these TV shows started to associate ancient Egypt with ancient aliens. They didn't associate space trader stories with ancient Egypt or time travel stories with ancient Egypt, but they did associate ancient alien or ancient astronaut stories with ancient Egypt. So I'm not saying it was Hollywood, but it was Hollywood. We can flip the slide forward. Super. So here's an idea which began as fiction, was presented as a fact by the 1960s, and inspired a whole new genre of fiction. So ancient Egypt had been popular in American fiction in the 20s and 30s, but mostly inspired not by Egyptology or ancient Egyptian sources, but by European and Islamic imaginations of what ancient Egypt was like. And this fed into later fantasy and horror and into the pseudo-archaeology in the 60s and 70s, but it didn't feed so much into the kind of science fiction that was being written in short stories and novels after the war. And I think it had something to do with tastemakers in print science fiction communities feeling that the Egypt of the pulps was not good science fiction. But when the pseudo-archaeology and these fantasy and horror elements fed into TV and film science fiction, it traveled from there into the science fiction pop culture from the 1990s onwards. And I think this is pretty remarkable because science fiction is a fairly conservative genre in terms of themes. There's still people writing slices of life in space, just like some famous Robert A. Heinlein stories. There's still time travel stories like H.G. Wells wrote. But this is a case where something became a part of science fiction popular culture, even though it wasn't part of these, wasn't popular with these famous writers in the mid-20th century. So I think that's a pretty unusual thing in the history of the genre. Now, we bring a slide forward. If we're talking about the boundary between truth and fiction, that's kind of a dark topic to think about too much. Because in our culture, we distinguish between fiction and lies on the grounds that fiction, the audience is supposed to know that something's not true. So they're just playing pretend when they when they read a fiction or hear some fiction. But if you look at, say, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, for example, they didn't really have a word that corresponds to our fiction. They talked about stories as being either true or false, or maybe partially false. But they didn't have this idea that there's a fiction that you're playing pretend about. And maybe that has some advantages because in practice, people can't always keep these boundaries between truth and fiction so separately. The science fiction author Elizabeth Moon retired from the military to rural Texas in, I believe, the 1970s. And at some point, she decided to have a stargazing party for some children in her neighborhood. Because she liked astronomy, she had a nice telescope, and they could come out and be entertained for an evening and look at the stars and the planets and learn some things. And when she did this, the people had fun, but she also found that some of the children in her neighborhood hadn't really believed in the astronomy they were learning in school. They just learned it was something they had to memorize. They had to be able to return it on a test, but they didn't really think it connected to the world that they were living in. It's pretty easy to make people learn to parrot some things or learn some formulas they're supposed to use if you put enough pressure on them. But it's not so easy to get them to really accept something into their worldview or to learn to use it as a tool. And well, that's maybe good when you're thinking about people breaking free from cultural indoctrination or having opinions which aren't so popular in their community. But it's not so good if you're trying to spread scientific thinking or the scientific worldview. And again, as we can see, these pseudo-archaeology ideas from the 60s and 70s, they're going strong, especially in the United States. They're certainly reaching much larger audiences than popular books by scientific archaeology. And I think so you can set out to do something that you're sure is just fiction. You think everybody's just playing pretend about it, but in the end, sometimes some people take things away from it that you didn't intend at all. And so that's maybe a bit frightening to think about too much. If we want something a little bit more hopeful, I guess you could say that these people in film and TV communities, even if they didn't say it out loud, maybe they saw what von Daniken was really doing, because his ideas are no good as science or archaeology, but they do make for fun stories, for fun science fiction, and arguably they're heavily inspired by by early science fiction, like H.P. Lovecraft's stories. So by turning them from something that was presented as fact to something that was presented as fiction, they maybe brought these ideas back where they belong in the world of fiction. And maybe in the future we'll see more people playing with ancient Egyptian science fiction that's not just inspired by von Daniken's ideas, but also by the many other exciting things you could do with ancient Egypt. So I don't know if that's much comfort, but at least something to think about. I guess we move the slide forward. And there we are, the further reading. And we can leave that up. Well, if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And thanks for everybody's patience with the technical troubles, especially with Zach for stepping up and doing his talk early.
And yeah, so before we take questions, I want to say thank you very much to you, Sean, for your perseverance and patience in over the technical difficulties, and thanks also for coming back to finish it up. So yeah, so do we have any questions? Oh, there we go. Do you have any ideas on who did build the pyramids or how they were built?
Okay, well, I'm not an Egyptologist, and there's different theories, but mostly I think one of these things, I think these theories show that if you're clever and you're determined and you have a lot of manpower and woman power and time on your hands, you can build some pretty impressive big things. And, it takes some smart engineering to figure out ways of moving giant stone blocks with just the ramps and rollers and boats. So I think that's pretty cool to think about, that just because you don't have all the technologies we have today, you still need a lot of engineering thinking to solve and problem solving.
Thanks. How big a factor do you think do you think is the lack of sorry, I'm trying to, to parse this question. There seems to be a myth that that instead of the ancient Egyptians building pyramids, ancient Israelites built them. What do you know about this, and what do you think of that?
I know a little bit about it, but I'm not so well informed as, for example, Jason Colavito. I believe Jason Colavito was working on a book that will talk about some of these Christian and Islamic myths about the pyramids. Because, again, in late antiquity, like say the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries AD, when the Roman Empire was Christian, knowledge of hieroglyphics seems to have died out in Egypt. So after that, people just had the stories they were telling about the pyramids and the ancient temples. And over time, and after the Islamic conquest of Egypt, memory got lost, and people had to be creative to make up stories about how it might have happened. And so, yeah, I think that the Israelites and the pyramids are another example where people take one story they know, the story about the Israelites in Egypt. They look at the pyramids and they say maybe they had something to do with the maybe that had something to do. Maybe that was what the Israelites built when they were slaves, or again, people just combining different stories to explain something that's really impressive and that they don't have other sources about.
Thanks. So I think that's the end of our questions. So thank you again to Sean for your talk.